any measure or matter or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote is ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Moran, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you'll stand with me, please.
Thank you all. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 4531, the Support for Patients and Communities Reauthorization Act, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 4531, to reauthorize certain programs that provide for...
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for an opening statement.
Chairman, thank you. I have to learn how to push that little button. You know, I'm new here. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the Patients and Communities Reauthorization Act. Drug overdose continues to plague our country. According to the CDC, more than 111,000 people died of drug overdose in the 12-month period ending April. I'm all too familiar with the dire situation since more than 50 miles of the Mexican border is my district, and the growth of fentanyl is so much so that a warehouse once built to house the bulky marijuana is now filled with fentanyl. And that's not years of production, that's 1 year of apprehensions that are seizures that are leading to hopefully convictions. But those convictions do not stop the flow of it. We are now dealing with what I think is the greatest harm to come along in years, which is an already devastating drug has now been mixed with xylene. That mix of fentanyl and this sedative or tranquilizer doesn't just make it more addictive and more quickly absorbed, but it also produces a byproduct, which is, in fact, the outbreak of untreatable wounds. Our emergency rooms are regularly dealing with this new concoction having a devastating effect on the very people who tend to live on the streets and are hoping to get off of it. So as we deal with this, we must, in fact, deal with the fatal overdoses and what is now becoming, even if you don't die, debilitating ongoing injuries. Even the DEA recognizes a growing threat of xylene. When Administrator Milgram discussed the challenges posed by this drug earlier this year, it's time to incorporate xylene as a Schedule III of the Controlled Substance Act and protect our citizens from this deadly drug. In closing, Mr. Chairman, let me make it clear, this is not a temporary problem. This is not a drug being abused that might fade away or might become less deadly. It is, in fact, a drug historically not taken by human beings that is being abused in a way that will only go away if we ruthlessly and regularly enforce it along with fentanyl. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for an opening statement.
Right. I've got my...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 4531, the Support for Patients and Communities Reauthorization Act, is a 30-page bill, most of which is not within this committee's jurisdiction. Buried deep within that bill, almost as if the Republicans thought we wouldn't notice, is a provision that would permanently place xyloxine, a veterinary medicine that is currently not federally controlled, on Schedule III of the Controlled Substances Act. We have all seen news reports about addicts who overdosed on fentanyl that was laced with xyloxine. Those stories are deeply disturbing and tragic. Democrats have been committed to fighting the opioid crisis and finding solutions to the issue of fentanyl addiction, which is the problem that this bill is trying to address. We have advanced legislation to make it easier for providers to offer medication-assisted treatment to drug addicts and to fund opioid addiction programs in rural areas. And we have passed numerous bills to combat global trafficking of fentanyl and its precursors. But the permanent scheduling of xyloxine is not the answer. We know very little about xyloxine. We know that it is an opioid adulterant, something that is added to an opioid such as fentanyl to prolong its effects and to allow addicts to stretch their supply. We also know that addicts do not use xyloxine on its own. But there is so much more that we do not know. We have never held a hearing on the use of xyloxine, let alone the subject of scheduling it. We do not know the scope of xyloxine use in the U.S. And critically, we have no evidence that xyloxine is addictive. Yet this bill would permanently schedule xyloxine as a controlled substance, causing a domino effect of harms without any answers to any of these questions. It would be legislating backwards. We already have a process in place for the scheduling of controlled substances. We should follow that process and follow the science. If the medical and scientific evaluation by the experts at the FDA tells us that xyloxine should be controlled, then we will schedule it. By foregoing that analysis, which is what this bill would do, we are simply legislating out of fear, a mistake that we have made too often in the past with devastating consequences. And that is a mistake that we do not need to make here, because the xyloxine problem is really a fentanyl problem. The criminals who are manufacturing and distributing fentanyl laced with xyloxine are already subject to prosecution. This bill will add nothing to the enforcement mechanisms that we already have. It's as if we tried to schedule baking soda because addicts use it to cut cocaine. What this bill will do is create a black market, with all the risk that entails, for a substance that is now freely available. In an apparent concession to corporate ranchers who want to be able to stockpile xyloxine for veterinary purposes, the bill imposes an enormous carve-out for xyloxine that is intended for non-human consumption. Consequently, addicts or drug dealers who are looking for xyloxine to make their fentanyl supply last longer will know exactly where to go. We cannot criminalize our way out of an addiction crisis. We have made this mistake over and over again. The war on drugs showed us that scheduling narcotics out of fear and political expediency can have devastating consequences for the most vulnerable in our communities. 50 years later, 50 years later, Congress is still trying to fix the crack cocaine disparity and the mass incarceration that it caused. And we are likely seeing xyloxine in our communities as a result of our crackdown on fentanyl, just as fentanyl replaced heroin and heroin replaced pills. We are playing whack-a-mole, and it is not working. It is possible to address the xyloxine problem with a more effective, more considered approach. We should follow the lead of President Biden, who has recognized that xyloxine poses an emerging threat to our communities, while offering a response plan that does not include permanent scheduling until we know more about the substance. Instead, the President recommends that we focus on treatment, harm reduction, and interrupting the supply of illicitly used xyloxine. The administration recommends that we explore scheduling and other regulatory options without doing an end run around the NDA, the FDA, and DEA by jumping straight to permanent scheduling by way of legislation. The administration wants us to follow the science. I understand my colleagues' instinct to do something, anything, to stem the flow of opioid deaths in this country. It is tempting to think that this bill will do that, but it will not. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will work together to find a bipartisan solution informed by facts and recent consideration to address the problem of fentanyl laced with xyloxine. Unfortunately, this legislation is not it. I urge my colleagues to oppose the bill, and before I yield back the balance of my time, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record two articles, one called Tracking Trank Laws, the State of Policy Responses to the Growing Xyloxine Crisis, and the other called Xyloxine, Animal Tranquilizer in the Drug Supply.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
And without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Issa for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4531 offered
Without
by
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered base text for the purposes of amendment. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California to explain the amendment.
Chairman, the amendment speaks for itself. What I want to do is respond to the ranking member's statements, because I think his statements are to a great extent accurate. One of the inaccuracies, of course, is that the items he put in calls xylazine a crisis, and I'm afraid that calling it a crisis in the very submissions he made and then acting as though we shouldn't act is a problem. Additionally, our crime subcommittee has dealt with this. In a hearing earlier this year, DEA Administrator Milgram discussed the challenges posed by this drug. She stated, and I quote, "Even look at xylazine right now, which is something we've been having conversation about, is lacing fentanyl. Certain states," and I repeat, certain states, "have now moved to schedule xylazine. It is not yet scheduled in the federal government. So these are challenges we face all the time." Mr. Chairman, these are challenges we face today, which is to deal with the DEA administrators in our oversight, in our appropriate vetting of this, made clear that this is a challenge that, first of all, now is disparate from states, inconsistent, something that we can deal with here in this committee. This is additionally an item where we have looked at it. Now, I'm going to tell a story of my youth. As a college freshman, I dealt with not one, not two, but three of my classmates overdosing on Quaaludes. They were, in fact, a veterinary medicine that had been taken out of the University of Michigan, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and these people were taking these tranquilizers that were designed to keep, I guess, cows from getting too excited during birth. I didn't think much of it at the time, except this was a small school, and people dying by taking this drug was a real problem. Was it in fact something you could easily get if you were had a herd of cattle or of cows? Yes, but that didn't change the fact that this was a dangerous drug. In this case, as we regularly look at trying to find the precursors and attack the precursors, we're not looking at, as the ranking member said, the most vulnerable among us. The people we are looking at are the predators who are assembling this deadly drug. And in fact, making this Schedule 3 will give us the opportunity to trace, track, and prosecute those who are assembling not one pill, but thousands or hundreds of thousands of pills that kill every day. It is, in fact, for the most vulnerable among us that we are today acting to make this a Schedule 3 drug. So I would take the ranking member's statements and say he was absolutely right in his statements, he was wrong in his conclusion. Lastly, I went back half a century to people dying of a drug that came out of the veterinary side. Now let's be more current. Every month, I am faced with, as we see homeless people in my own community, I'm faced with seeing those wounds on homeless people. In my office, I have a number of pictures, and they're not from homeless people. They're from people in upscale La Jolla who are addicted to these drugs, people who used to be among the most affluent of our society, who now have open sores that cannot heal. And they cannot heal as long as they continue to take the drug laced with this tranquilizer. So not just for the deaths of fentanyl, but for the destruction of families from the very vulnerable to the very wealthy. We have to act now to give the tools to the DEA, as I believe was asked for in our hearing. Doing so will, in fact, not affect the vulnerable by their being prosecuted, but, in fact, target those who create and assemble these deadly and destructive drugs.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Of course I would yield.
I'm sympathetic to what you are trying to do. I do have a concern that we haven't had the general science review that we have before scheduling, and that in such cases we generally do a temporary schedule instead of a permanent. But one of the questions I have is, what impact, if any, would this have on animal husbandry and the proper use for this chemical? Do we know that?
I think we do, and I appreciate the gentlelady. Very clearly, This is a drug currently that should be prescribed by veterinarians and dosed out in less than bulk amount. So there is one concern that has been brought to me that I think is appropriate, and that is, would a large operation that has a very large amount of it be affected? And the answer is they would have to be in more contact with their vet to make sure that they didn't stockpile large amounts. But other than that, there's no question at all that this could continue. Right now, it's prescribed by veterinarians. It will continue to be, but it will be stored in a safer way and accounted for based on whether the doses are in fact appropriate for the amount of animal husbandry that's being treated.
Gentleman's out of time. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Klein?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask the gentleman from California if he would yield for a question.
Of course.
So my reading of the bill, I'm not on the crime sub, skipping over Title I, looking at Title II. I'm just reading the appropriate language where this is purporting to move it on the schedule. Does it in fact require that it be moved on the schedule, or is it simply directing the DOJ and the FDA and to review, provide reports, and then, if appropriate, initiate rulemaking proceedings? Does it give them that option?
I thank you for your question. Your question leads to the exact right answer, which is it only authorizes, gives them the authority. In fact, as the ranking member said, administration. This will be a decision by the administration. We're simply creating the authorization to do that based on the science.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Maryland. Is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Issa, I co-sponsored a similar bill that was offered by Mr. Panetta, H.R. 1839. I think it had some similarities, but it really was just targeted at providing penalties. I wondered if the chair had a chance to take a look, because I didn't realize that this was sort of essentially the same topic and area. Has the gentleman had a chance to compare the two bills?
Yes, and I appreciate the question, if the gentleman would yield. The penalties of being Schedule III in violation would come in harmony if the administration chooses to make it a Schedule III drug. So it is not just sympathetic, but would accomplish substantially the same thing. And Congressman Panetta, I think, envisioned upping it, but we're looking at giving the administration the ability not only to put it in a category where the penalties would apply, but also have the control systems that would come with it being a Schedule III drug, which is a big part of what we're empowering the administration to consider.
And if I could reclaim my time briefly, with respect to the issue of whether it's permanently scheduled or temporarily scheduled, my quick review of this is that this is aimed at permanent scheduling on Schedule III?
I thank the gentleman. It authorizes the permanent scheduling, of course. One of the things that in my 23 years here I've learned is no laws are permanent. All things are relatively and can be changed. And no question at all, at a future time there could be a decision to encourage the administration to change the classification. They would have the authority to do that themselves. We're not ordering this to be Schedule III. We are authorizing them to make that decision. And so, in a sense, yes, it is permanent, but it only authorizes to be permanent. But I thank the gentleman. Yield back.
Thank you. I've taken a look at, let's see, page 22 of the bill. I don't know, is that the same one I've got? And this would be lines 19 through 23. And so, just to read it quickly, I running out of time. Schedule 3 in Section 202C of the Controlled Substance Act, I'll skip the site, is amended by adding at the end of the following, quote, F, xylazine, period, close quotes. So what's the chair's understanding of the meaning of that language?
if you flip to the next page, 23, and you see the reports, including 1 year after, that includes where the drug is being diverted, where the drug is being originated, and so on. It doesn't end at 22. It's in context the whole next page.
Would the gentleman yield?
It's the gentleman's time.
Yes.
Yeah, I think what it means is that xyloxine is permanently scheduled, albeit there is a report later. But meanwhile, it's permanently scheduled, not temporarily scheduled. I yield back.
Just to reclaim my time. So, Chairman Issa, given the colloquy we just had, I'd be more comfortable with legislation in the way that you had described it. And if we could clarify this language so that it sounded more like what you were saying. In other words, we were giving the authority to the DEA to decide, or whoever, to decide whether it should be on Schedule 3 or not, rather than mandating it by statute. I'd be a lot more comfortable.
No, and if the gentleman would yield.
I would yield.
I know we're looking at a nuance, and it's an important nuance. We are authorizing them to create permanent Schedule 3. We are not mandating them. The administration could choose to come back to us and say, we're uncomfortable, we're not going to make it Schedule 3. So the reality is, if they choose to make it Schedule 3, we see this as it should be permanent. But there is a consultation, and again, this is one of those odd situations where the ranking member, bless his heart, believes that the administration hasn't acted, and we're just simply empowering the administration to act with a trust that they will make the right decision. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time's running out, but if
Just for a quick
sorry.
yield,
yes.
this is not an authorization. This puts this drug permanently on the list, and maybe that in the end will be the right result, but we don't have any of the normal background information. This is not like an authorization. This puts it on the list.
Gentleman's
I
out.
yield back.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman's out.
I thank the chair and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Cohen, seek recognition? Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. This does put it on the Schedule 3, and Mr. Issa says it would authorize the FDA. I don't think the FDA has to be authorized to do anything. They have the right and the duty to look at any drug and see how it would be scheduled. And I would hope this caption is large enough, I'm having my staff is looking into it, to amend this to make it a much better bill, to list cannabis as a Schedule 3 drug, something they should have done many, many, many years ago, because we waste a lot of money with that, and we need research, et cetera, and this would require them to do what they have not done in the past. And so I'd ask if Mr. Issa has considered the capacity of this bill to carry a cannabis Schedule 3 listing as well.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I think I want to make sure that we are clear, because we believe that, yes, we're ordering in this bill a Schedule 3. If you look at page 23, what we're actually going is we're saying within a year we can, in fact, move this if the DEA recommends so. This is a strange situation in which we know this is a deadly and debilitating drug. We know that we want to go after the people who assemble, and this empowers that drug to be controlled in that way. But we also know that the DEA, if they feel it's inappropriate after 1 year, this is not permanent in that sense that it can never be relooked at. In fact, their reports and their recommendation would be relooked at. And I think we have to have some trust that this is why we give the DEA the authority we do, and why this report envisions 1 year. Congress would have to act within 1 year, and that's really why I said page 22 has to be looked at by complete reading of page 23, which I believe gives us that temporary nature, if appropriate, but not temporary today, so that we must reauthorize in a short period of time, which is
I'm going to reclaim my time, Mr. Issa, because my question to you was amending this bill to make it a much better bill, to have cannabis classified as Schedule 3, which would save hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Americans charged with crimes that are recognized in most states more than this drug as being legal and being of medical use, and the FDA has just dropped the ball on it.
I've been told by if the gentleman would yield.
Yeah,
I've been told by the parliamentarian that it's not germane, sufficient to amend the bill. I share with you the fact that we do have a separate problem, which is the disparate laws throughout our country where you have this drug that has been made the equivalent of the most deadly drugs, and yet it's legal in so many of our states, including mine. So I share with you that. I'm happy to work with you on separate legislation, but I'm told by the parliamentarian we can't add it to this.
Mr. Issa, I want to thank you for your consideration. I look forward to working with you on that. I was pleased to yield to you, and the opportunity I had to yield to you the last time, I didn't realize it was you when I said that, but it was still on a roll, but you're my friend, and if I'd have known it was you, I would have found a more nuanced way to have done it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back on that roll. Who seeks recognition? Ms. Sparks? Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I just wanted to ask Representative Issa, for one thing, if we could add, and maybe we can do it with bill moves further. I think this is a very serious issue, and we're authorizing more money, and it's important for us to deal with this issue, but also it's important for us to have accountability and reporting that actually does benefit the people that get this treatment. So what I would like to ask, if we could also add another reporting requirement where actually we can report how much money is spent per each person receiving this treatment. Because I've seen, like when I calculate Medicaid dollars in the state of Indiana, we spend $100,000 per person per year, and people are not getting the best care. So I want to make sure that actually it goes to the people and benefit the people that would try to provide this treatment and not just pay big salaries and big bureaucracy. So I would appreciate if Mr. Issa would work with me and see if we can add that additional requirement. And as accounting, I think these numbers are very important for Congress to make these decisions that money are properly spent.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I yield to Mr. Issa.
I absolutely be delighted to work on, and we could both send a letter and follow up with the Energy and Commerce Committee, which that part of the bill is in their jurisdiction, but I think the gentlelady is right, and I'm happy to work to see that it's put in by the committee.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from California is recognized. Ms. Lofgren? No? Mr. Cray is recognized. 5 minutes.
Chairman, move to strike the last word.
Yes, gentleman's recognized.
And to my colleague from California, I agree with you. This is a very deadly drug when abused, but it has legitimate uses. So I'm trying to figure out your legislation, how would that minimize its abuse? Because how does this drug get from the veterinarian's office to the streets of a city to be abused?
Would the gentleman yield?
How does your legislation minimize that probability?
Thank you for yielding. The fact is that you're hitting the nail on the head. We're not going after the drug when it's in a pill. We're going after the people who are in the supply chain getting it into the fentanyl, mixing it. This drug, in fact, will continue to be prescribed and available for animal husbandry appropriate. It's an effective tranquilizer. It has to be used infrequently even on animals. But by making it a Schedule III, by having it there, it means we can attack a precursor that is being used that is both deadly and debilitating. We can attack it on those who are dealing with it in bulk. If you're a vet and you've got, I'm going to use a hypothetical, a pound of it, and that's 10,000 doses, there's something wrong. On the other hand, you'll still have a wholesaler that has pounds of it. You'll still have vets that have appropriate doses of it. And you'll still have the individual farmer, rancher, who will have prescribed amounts of it. This is no different than any other prescribed drug. What we're really able to do is to seize large amounts that are found and to prosecute for possession of that. As long as it's in the supply chain and being legally prescribed, there's no crime.
So would you be looking at the manufacturer or the wholesaler? Seizing it is one thing, but where would you be seizing it from?
The gentleman's point, if he further yield, is exactly right. As a Schedule III controlled drug, we will start with the DEA will start with the manufacturer. You now have a Schedule III drug. You have this reporting requirement. We look at the distribution. The fact is, we expect, and this is just me talking as someone with a border district, but Congressman's been there with me over the years, we are going to be looking probably at Chinese-made, going into Mexico, coming over our border. We will be, in fact, working on the supply chain, much of it clandestine.
If I may, what are the probability of a legitimate user, a farmer, getting in trouble for having an excess amount of this medication in their farm?
The chances would only be if the DEA finds a diversion where he's buying in large quantity and diverting. It is unlikely that someone's going to have that, but of course you could have somebody who gets into being part of the supply chain because they can buy it for $1 and sell it for 10, not to put it into the animal. But that is certainly a possibility. I know that the gentleman knows that most of the fentanyl trans combination are actually originating in Mexico, but there will be some domestic, and of course we want to go after that.
I'm just concerned about the probability of a legitimate user being caught up in the criminal justice system and then having major issues.
And if the gentleman further yield,
Yes.
every veterinarian is dealing with a number of drugs, some of them Schedule III, that in fact go to horses, cows, chickens, whatever it happens to be. So this simply falls into that same control. The gentleman's absolutely right. Everyone who has a large farm deals with the vet on a regular basis and does have to control the drugs that they're using for their animals. It doesn't change it to some sort of a drug that can only be administered by the vet in a hospital situation. It's still going to be a drug that goes that. It simply empowers when they find a diversion or they find a bulk amount that might have originated in China and in fact never went through the factory system, and that's the drug they'll be trying to find.
Would the gentleman yield?
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I have an amendment which I think will satisfy the gentleman's concerns and, in fact, concerns expressed by everybody so far. I yield back.
But the gentleman further yield.
Of course, 3 seconds.
This is one of those things where we want to do what the Biden DEA is asking us to do, which is empower them to have a tool. It came out of a legitimate hearing, and I think before it goes to the floor, I would expect that the Biden DEA could weigh in. And if I'm wrong and they weigh in that they don't want this bill, I wouldn't be surprised that it dies. But I believe that they will be supportive, and they were supportive in our hearing.
Gentleman's time's expired. Does yet another Californian seek recognition? Mr. Liu's recognized for 5 minutes. No, sir, not you. Down there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word. I have some questions for Representative Issa. If your bill became law, would people still be able to do medical research on this drug?
Gentleman would yield? Yes.
And currently, you don't need a prescription for the use of this drug?
No, it is a prescribed drug.
So if it becomes, under your bill, becomes Schedule III, does it put any additional burdens on the veterinarian?
Science research.
None. They prescribe other Schedule III drugs.
Okay. And then I'm just trying to understand what you've said about the bill and the language I'm reading, and because you said it authorized administration, and then when I read on page 22, it says placement of xylazine on Schedule 3, and it says Schedule 3 is amended by adding at the end of the following xylazine. It doesn't seem like the administration has discretion. It seems like it's just added. And I'm just trying to understand.
If the gentleman would yield, that's the reason that you have the year and so on. Yes, it will go to Schedule 3. The administration, in fact, in that 1 year can say, no, it shouldn't be Schedule 3 any longer, here's the reason.
Well, the
And
gentleman
Congress can act. That's why I said no
Gentleman,
law is permanent, even if you put something on a permanent schedule.
I appreciate that. So I'm just,
Well, the gentleman
I would like the bill to say that. So where does it say that? Where does it say the administration can sort of reject xylazine?
Well, gentleman yield.
Yes.
When I asked my initial.
I think if the gentleman further yield,
Yes.
a year later, within the year, we can act again. It does, in fact, put it on the schedule, but it also says that the administration can recommend and we can act to reduce it. And that's the reason that I said no law is permanent.
Well, the gentleman yield.
If you just point me to the page where it says that,
It's page 2.
yes, I'll yield.
I thank the gentleman. The earlier colloquy, when I raised the possibility that this was optional for the administration, after Mr. Ivy's questions, I relooked at it. It looks like it does go ahead and put it on Schedule 3. But then right after that, on page 22, line 24, report to Congress on xylazine. It says an initial report, additional report, and it asks for recommendations with respect to whether xylazine should be transferred to another schedule. So it says, go ahead and schedule it, put it under Schedule 3, and then get reports as to whether it should be moved. It doesn't give them that power to move it. It says, come back to Congress if you want to move it, but give us reports back on whether that's successful on Schedule 3. I agree, we don't want to jump to put something on a Schedule 3 that doesn't need to be. But since this was the subject of a hearing in subcommittee, I'm going to yield to my colleagues as to whether it does need to be on Schedule 3.
So I
Yield back.
reclaim my time. So let me just say this. I think you can get a very strong bipartisan vote if that issue was just clarified. I think we want to. I think many Democrat members want to support this bill. I think Chairman Adler may have or Ranking Member Adler may have an amendment, but I think we're trying to get to yes on this. And if you could
If
help
the gentleman
Would the gentleman yield?
Gentleman would yield.
I'll yield to Representative Lofgren.
I want to clarify that the only exemption is for animal husbandry. There isn't an exemption for science research. And so I do think there is an interference with the potential scientific research under this bill. And as has been mentioned by our friends across the aisle, this is permanently put on Section 3. And yes, there'll be a report in a year, but it would take an additional act of Congress to change it. So it's really not it's not discretionary. It's not, the scientists would not be able to change it without an additional act of Congress. And of course, that wouldn't be possible because the scientists would be precluded from studying it under the bill. I'm eager actually to do something about this, but I think there are some problems with the bill as drafted, and especially speaking as a member of the Science Committee, the constraint on scientific research, I think, is unwise, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Would the gentleman further yield?
I'll further yield, yes.
I think what we have is a failure to agree that we can get to, and here's how I'd like to get to it. Energy and Commerce unanimously voted this out, Republicans and Democrats. Clearly, we have a joint jurisdiction situation, but I think it's one in which I can make the commitment on behalf of the full committee chair that we will not move this to the bill and to the floor until we have worked with Energy and Commerce to clear up the questions, particularly of scientific use. And I think we have to recognize that it could well be also their jurisdiction, but I'm happy to guarantee that we will work with them in consultation to make sure this bill only moves if it still allows exactly what you're asking for, full and complete access for scientific research.
Thank you. My time has
I've
expired.
got to intervene and quote Henry Hyde, who said,
I will allow that, yes.
the Democrats, Henry said, the Democrats are our adversaries. The Energy and Commerce Committee is our enemy.
Well played. The gentlelady from California.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition? Yes. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, which I think will clear up most of this.
Clerk will report the amendment.
I'd reserve a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4531 offered by Mr. Nadler of New York.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of an amendment What? Sorry. The amendment
Will be considered as read.
be considered as read. We'll do that. Gentleman's recognized. Explain his
Thank you,
amendment.
Mr. Chairman. This amendment would make the schedule of xyloxine immediate but temporary rather than permanent, so it wouldn't require an act of Congress to undo it. This is how we address fentanyl-related substances. There's no reason to act more severely, more rashly, and with less information about a substance that is an additive rather than the actual opioid itself. This amendment would require the Attorney General and the Secretary of HHS to study the scheduling of xyloxine under the Controlled Substances Act. Excuse me. It will allow us to regulate xyloxine immediately while giving us time to get the scientific and medical evaluations we need to make an informed decision about permanent scheduling. We can hold hearings to assess how prevalent xyloxine use is around the country, what the consequences of scheduling will be, and whether there should be broad exceptions. As it stands now, there are legitimate questions about whether xyloxine should be scheduled at all. There are questions about the impact of having a carve-out to scheduling for xyloxine intended for non-human use. The process outlined by the Controlled Substances Act will answer those questions. It will allow us to avoid the mistakes we made when we listened to those who told us incorrectly that crack was more dangerous than powder. We are still trying to right that wrong. This amendment would achieve the goal of immediate regulation of xyloxine while obtaining the information we need to make sound policy going forward. It represents a reasonable compromise that I urge my colleagues to support. It, in fact, answers the questions that have been raised here, the objections that have been raised by most people. Xyloxine will be controlled immediately, but temporarily, and we would have the choice after a year, with all the advice that we would have gotten in the interim, of scheduling it permanently or saying, no, we shouldn't. So I urge the adoption of this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Does the gentleman insist on his point of order?
No, I withdraw the point of order.
Point of order withdrawn. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the amendment. It was back in 1971 when Congress exercised its authority and created the schedules that we're working with today in terms of drugs. And marijuana at that time was placed on Schedule 1. And so since that time, it has been demonstrated time and time again that marijuana, or cannabis, does not belong on Schedule 1, but we cannot seem to muster the ability here in Congress to remove it. And so the same thing will happen to any other substance, any other drug that Congress decides to place on a schedule, as opposed to allowing the FDA to do its job and to make the call. And so I think that this amendment is a good one. I'm also concerned about the fact that when we place another drug on Schedule 3, there are criminal penalties associated with possession with intent, with sale, with trafficking. What tends to happen is possession cases tend to be made on those at the lowest end of the totem pole. It's the user, the person who is addicted. And so what we do is criminalize what is really a public health issue. And we criminalize it by placing convictions on the records of nonviolent people who tend to be located in the inner cities of our country. And so we end up having folks with criminal records who can't get student loans, who are not eligible for public assistance, who are barred from various professional occupations because of the mark of being a convicted felon. And so this is a way of expanding the portal or the entry into the criminal justice system, and permanent stains on people who are unable at that point, after being convicted, to rise to their highest level. And at the same time, they're getting no treatment for the underlying condition that allowed them or caused them to fall into this possession trap. And so I'm worried about over-criminalization. I'm worried about, well, I support this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Chairman. Mr. Fitzgerald is recognized for 5 minutes.
Strike. Let me just go back. I wish I would have spoken with Congressman Guthrie about this before our markup today. I'm assuming that it emerged from the involvement of state of Kentucky in horse racing. That's an assumption on my own part, but I know that obviously the drug that Xanazine is used in that industry. But with that being said, let me just kind of bring things back to where we're at. This is from the DEA Joint Intelligence Report, October 2022. The expanded use of Xanazine as an adulterant may be driven in part by its low cost and lower risk of law enforcement scrutiny, as it is not a controlled substance. It's from the DEA. Moreover, its addition to fentanyl can increase the profit for traffickers and attract additional customers. It is difficult to assess with certainty how widespread the use is or the true number of Xanazine involved in overdose deaths without expanded testing, okay? But they know it's happening all the time. The emergence across the United States appears to be following the same path as fentanyl, beginning with white powder heroin markets in the Northeast before spreading to the South and then working its way into drug markets westward. This pattern indicates the use of Xanazine as an adulterant will likely increase and become commonly encountered in the illicit fentanyl supply. Xanazine use throughout the United States may also follow the pattern seen in Puerto Rico and emerge as a drug of abuse on its own in the future, although it's unlikely to replace fentanyl or other opiates among illicit drug users. So, I mean, this stuff is nasty. And if it has that effect on animal husbandry, the veterinary industry, then that's something to deal with at a later date. But right now, this stuff is moving as quickly as fentanyl across the U.S. And all this talk this morning about, well, you know, we hate to see it move to Schedule 3, and then later on we'll have to revisit it. I mean, it just seems that I'm shocked by the insignificant notice of the urgency here.
Would the gentleman
this
yield?
stuff is moving right now. So.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I would yield.
I would point out that the amendment satisfies the gentleman's concern. It immediately schedules xyloxine. It places on the controlled substances list immediately, and it orders various studies. At the end of a year, it would be removed from the list unless Congress, having been convinced by those studies, decides it should stay there. But it would immediately place it on the controlled substances list. So that would satisfy the gentleman's concerns. It would immediately place it on the list, and we'd have a year to study it.
Well, my point is that there just seems to be kind of this lack of urgency amongst Congress to address this issue. This is something that we have been well aware of. DEA underscored this, found it important to put out this joint intelligence report in 2022. So we need to take action on this, and we need to do it today.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield?
Well, yeah.
Thank you. You know, I might mention, for context, 2024 is just around the corner, and that's when we're going to, quote, have to deal with the temporary nature of fentanyl as Schedule 3. We made a mistake by not recognizing a drug that is responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, thousands in my district, tens of thousands or more in my state last year. That drug is temporary. And in fact, the DEA wants it permanent. I'm hoping that when it comes up for a reconsideration that we finally make it permanent. But today we are considering a drug that was on no one's radar until it became part of a deadly drug being more deadly, more addictive, and debilitating because of the sores that and the nature, the untreatable sores that it creates. That's the reason we're dealing with it. It's the reason that we know that it's not going to be temporary in its nature as long as fentanyl is plaguing us, and it's an additive for fentanyl and other drugs.
Would the gentleman yield?
It's the gentleman's time.
I yield back.
Gentleman's out of time, yields back. Does the ranking member seek recognition?
Yes, I do.
Gentleman's recognized.
Move to strike the last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd just like to point out to Mr. Issa that this amendment does exactly what you're talking about. It immediately places xyloxine on the control list, orders studies, and Congress, having the benefits of those studies a year from now, can decide whether to permanentize it or not. But we're not taking any chances. We're not endangering anybody. We're putting it on the controlled substance list immediately. So I would hope there should be consensus that the best thing to do is not to rush to judgment as we have in the past on some drugs to our regret, but it immediately places it on the list now, gives us time to consider and to decide what to do in a year.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I think we are talking two sides of a coin here. I agree that we don't want to drag our feet and so on, but I believe that fentanyl being still temporary and having to go through reauthorization when everyone in this room knows that the numbers are in, and it is scary how dangerous it is, and now this is what's made it even more so. So I want to correct next year. I want to correct the problem with fentanyl being temporary. I don't want to make the same mistake here. ENC, on a bipartisan basis, a voice vote, literally made the same decision, which is this, because it is a precursor or a product that is being mixed with fentanyl, needs to be a Schedule III, the same as fentanyl.
Reclaiming my time. Yes, but we don't want to make the same mistake we made with regard to crack cocaine as opposed to cocaine. We are going to, I assume, in a year or whenever that comes up, make fentanyl permanent. And this says we're putting xyloxine on the list now, and probably about the same time with it, we consider fentanyl for permanency, we can consider this for permanency, and it's our decision. But let's not jump to judgment. Be safe by not automatically making it. It'll be prohibited from day one, and it's up to us a year from now to decide whether the evidence shows you should make it permanent or not. I don't see how anyone could object to that. On the one hand, it gives us the ability to deal with it as we're dealing with fentanyl. On the other hand, it gives us the ability to avoid the mistake we made with crack cocaine.
Chairman,
would the gentleman yield?
Further yield?
Yes.
You know, I guess my problem is that I'm looking at the history of fentanyl being kicked down the road time and time again and saying we need to learn from this mistake. That's the reason we're doing this in a way in which the administration can come back to us and ask us to reconsider it the other way. But knowing that fentanyl and this drug are not only deadly, but right now we are giving out for free and putting on the streets of San Diego, naloxone, this miracle drug that when you're dead, they pump it into you and you come back to life after you've overdosed on fentanyl. This drug is making that less effective. Less people are coming back from the dead or near dead because of this drug. This drug is more addictive, more quickly, and oh, by the way, the antidote that has been saving lives.
Which drugs? Fentanyl or
It's xylazine. Xylazine makes you less responsive to come back from fentanyl overdose. And we're dealing with the fact that more people are dying because of this. And,
reclaiming my time. That's exactly why we're prohibiting it immediately. And if the gentleman's fears are borne out after the appropriate FDA and other research, we'll ban it permanently.
Will the ranking member yield for a moment?
Sure.
my understanding is that fentanyl, part of the reason it's on the status that it is currently is because there are legitimate uses, and the point was to work their way through it before there was a decision about making it permanent or not. I think with respect to this, we know a lot less about, or I do anyway, xylazine than we know about fentanyl. I think in, Chairman Issa, in part of what you're saying, you're sort of conflating fentanyl and xylazine in a way that I don't know makes sense for us with respect to the final determination of whether xylazine should be permanently scheduled or not. I'd separate fentanyl out. I know it's used as a mix, but there are examples, like for PCP, for example, was frequently mixed with tobacco and other types of, you all might not know what PCP is, but it's an animal tranquilizer that was a major problem in the DC area. Didn't spread around the country, but it was addictive, deadly, and also caused long-term health damages, including mental health damage like schizophrenia and the like.
Reclaiming my time for a moment.
The time's expired.
I know.
Okay.
But just reclaiming my time just for a moment.
Taming the climate doesn't have.
I'll point out that everybody's concerns seem to be taken care of by this amendment because it bans it immediately. Research is done by the FDA and whoever else, and we're trusting ourselves to make a decision on its permanence a year from now. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. He yields back.
Mr. Chairman. I move the
Who seeks recognition. Ms. Jackson Lee, I'm sorry. Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Issa. I'm going to give you a compliment. I know that you are well committed to these issues, and as well as the members collectively. This comes under our subcommittee, and I would like to make a pronouncement that we are fighting fentanyl in the street, and none of us want fentanyl to be at the level that it is. And I think my colleague from Maryland, and I know my colleague from New York, made points that fentanyl can be found in hospitals. So we have a challenge. With respect to xylazine, I don't want to profess scientific and medical training, but it is my understanding that it is not addictive, or we do not have enough information about that. But I respect your concern, Mr. Issa. And I truly believe that we have found common ground in the amendment by Mr. Nadler, because I don't know whether law enforcement, DEA, has had their opportunity for analysis, whether FDA has had their opportunity, and whether any elements of HHS that would need to assess and any other agency have had their ability to analyze for the permanent labeling, or scheduling rather, of xylazine. So I would make the argument of scheduling xylazine temporary rather than permanent, exactly the type of measured response that we need to combat the opioid epidemic. It mirrors how we approach fentanyl, though again, let me make a breaking news statement. It is a lowest of low fentanyl in its devastation and its ability to kill, but we must move on that with facts, because it does have other uses. As I said, walk into a hospital and you'll find medical professionals using it and saying they need it for the patients and the care that they're giving. We knew far more about those substances when we decided to temporarily schedule them, meaning fentanyl and other substances, opioid-related, than we know about xylazine. We lose nothing, absolutely nothing, by making the scheduling decision temporary. Your concerns are answered. DHH will have the ability to do scientific evaluation that we need before making a permanent scheduling decision. And we will not have legislated in haste. We may even give some ground movement for the fentanyl scheduling. And we already know the devastating consequences of attaching criminal penalties to drugs without complete information about their impact. We made that mistake, and this committee has dealt with it, and we remember our former chairman, who spent a lot of time on dealing with the question of opioid expansion, addiction wave. It was overwhelming. And we produced out of this legislation an opioid prevention bill, but it did not stop the tide of the disparities between crack cocaine and the prisons that were filled up in particular by African Americans and Latinos and others and young people. So rather than coming back years from now to correct mistakes that could cost people their liberty, we can take one simple step in making xylazine schedule temporary. I really think, Mr. Iser, knowing your commitment and serious concern, that this allows us to take an action today without creating long-term irretrievable steps that we can get back. My colleagues who support the scheduling of xylazine can have no reasoned basis for opposing this amendment. Nothing in this amendment stops Congress from making the scheduling decision permanent tomorrow. Should the scientific evidence show that permanent scheduling is warranted, all this amendment does is give us our options while we gather the information. And while it is temporary, you're still getting the impact that you desire, which is to ensure the lack of abuse and that those who need to be protected are protected. So, breaking news as I conclude. I abhor fentanyl. It is killing people. It is dangerous. And we need to move quickly on getting the continued assessment. But repetitively, redundantly, today's hospitals and medical professionals use it. So how do we find that even line? Today, we can deal with this particular drug and get where we need to go by this temporary provision, and xylazine will be not openly used without penalty. I ask my colleagues to support the Nadler Amendment, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Move the strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm hoping to speak last, but you never know. I think there's been a lot. You never know. I believe there's been a lot of good debate, and I believe the debate has strengthened my belief that we should not make this one-year temporary in the way that Ranking Member Nadler wants to. And here's the reason. I heard my colleagues on the other side of the aisle unanimously saying fentanyl is terrible, it's deadly, we need to fight it, it is killing over 100,000 people a year, it is debilitating many more because of xylazine. We're saying that at a time in which we still have fentanyl as temporary because we made it temporary initially, and we've been unwilling to touch that hot stove again more than making it temporary, kicking it down the road. This is not a temporary problem. I don't want to sound overly hyperbolic, but none of my constituents are temporarily dead. They're permanently dead. Their families are permanently devastated. The damage is permanent. And this drug is deliberately being repurposed into making fentanyl more deadly, fentanyl more addictive, and fentanyl less able to be recovered from on an overdose. In one of my counties, we are presently trying someone for murder and trying to make it murder to make someone believe that they were taking a legal drug when in fact it was fentanyl mixed with xylazine. It was fentanyl that killed a young co-ed who thought she was simply taking half a pill to in fact get her homework done and do better in college, and she was trying to avoid a higher price pharmaceutical that she thought it was. She just thought she was buying a Canadian pharmaceutical. She's dead, and she's permanently dead. So I am being a little hyperbolic. This is making people more likely to be permanently dead from fentanyl. I do not believe, not here and not in my district, that anyone is going to be prosecuted for having a dose of xylazine. They're going to prosecute people who are moving this as part of a precursor, in fact, because they are mixing it, because they are scoring it for that purpose. Nobody's, right now, when this appears, it never has a reason to be in the hands of some poor underserved person on the street. They're not taking this as a tranquilizer. They're getting this in pill form mixed with other drugs to make it more addictive. And that's the reason it needs to be and will continue to be a drug. Now, will they switch to some other drug that has a similar effect if they can find one? Yes. Will it be whack-a-mole? Yes. But as long as we do not secure the distribution of this drug as a precursor to make fentanyl more deadly, we will not solve it. And yes, I am committed to make fentanyl a permanent, not a temporary Schedule III drug so that we can prosecute. Of course, I yield to the
Thank you.
ranking.
I am committed to making fentanyl a permanent drug too, but I would simply point out with respect to the amendment. The amendment makes xyloxine controlled immediately. It lets us study whether it's the right or wrong thing to do, and a year from now, it's up to us again. We have learned that we should certainly make fentanyl permanent. We may learn that we should certainly make xyloxine permanent, or we may learn that we shouldn't. It gives us the power a year from now, and that's why this amendment is the right thing to do, because it immediately, there's no danger right away because it immediately schedules it. But then the appropriate studies are done, which have never been done before. And we'll find out whether, like marijuana, cannabis, it never should have been scheduled, or whether, like fentanyl, it should certainly be scheduled, and that'll be up to us. So I urge the adoption of the amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman.
And reclaiming and closing out my time, I don't know that this will carry the day, but Mr. Nadler, I will work with you between now and the floor with Energy and Commerce, which I have more faith in perhaps because I served for 2 years on that committee, to make sure that we do look at whether there is a compromise that we could do along with our sister committee. But I do believe that if we had the power unlimited today to say we were going to make both of these drugs permanent, that we would have a hard time making fentanyl permanent when we all know we should. And so that's the reason that I reluctantly will oppose this amendment, but I will work with the gentleman and agree to meet with the chairman and ranking member of ENC to see if we can't work out something before it comes to the floor, because I do want to make sure that this is a bill that is unanimously approved or nearly unanimously approved on the House floor, because I think it's that important. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from California.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
If I could ask Representative Eisen another question. Normally, the Drug Enforcement Agency can add, delete, or change drugs on the schedules. If your bill became law, would the DEA, for example, 2 years from now, could they say, we're going to remove xylazine from Schedule 3?
The gentleman would yield.
Yes.
I believe that if we give it to them, they can have temporary scheduling authority, that's where the move, add, and changes occur. And that's, they haven't asked for that. I don't believe they want that. Again, between now and the time it goes to the floor, I'm happy to also have an additional meeting with the administration, because I believe that their support for this is going to be essential to make this a broadly bipartisan vote on the House floor, and I want that. So if the gentleman wants to have that along with the ranking member, I'm certainly would join in a request that the administration meet with us, because I have no doubt that they want the authority this way, and if they don't, if they want a modification, I will work together to have that modification on the floor in a package.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Kentucky. Oh, gentleman from California. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to support the amendment because it takes us a small step away from what I see is a questionable policy. But I'm looking at the overall bill, and this looks like every federal grant writer's wildest fantasy. I'm looking through the bill, I'm finding lavish increases in, quote, grants to address the problems of persons who experience violence-related stress, loan repayment program for the substance... Sorry, I forgot to silence my cell phone. But loan repayment program for substances...
That's a whip team calling him.
Getting back to the point, you've got a loan repayment program for substance use disorder treatment workforce, pilot program for public health laboratories, treatment recovery and workforce support grants, a grant program for state and tribal response for opioid use disorders, grant programs for opioid reversal agents, grant programs to address other concurrent substance use disorders, not to mention funding studies for everything even remotely related to the subject. To me, this looks like a poster child of how to throw money at a problem with nothing to show for it at the end. I'm reminded of that scene from Ghostbusters where they're informed they've lost their government grant and might have to go into the private sector. The private sector, shrieks one of them, "I've been in the private sector. They expect results." There are no results demanded in these grants, loan forgiveness programs, studies, and task forces. Well, what I've observed with these grant programs over the years is there's no follow-up, no oversight, nothing to show for it in the end when all's said and done. These grants ultimately disappear into the salaries of the grantees so they can write glowing reports about their plans to justify even bigger grants in the next cycle. They get buried and forgotten in the federal bureaucracy, which keeps churning out money for them, like the magical salt mine of lore, until it ultimately sinks the ship. If the federal government needs something it can't produce itself, we ought to send out an RFP and then reward an enforceable contract to the lowest responsible bidder and not throw money at every direction and hope something good comes of it. And of course, we throw lots of new money, other people's money, at the problem to show that we care. Well, I can't support the bill for this reason. I would ask anyone, before we plus up and extend all of these grant programs and studies, can anyone tell me any good that they've done so far?
If the gentleman would yield.
I'm done.
If the gentleman, by that is yielding briefly, this may be where the late Henry Hyde made his point. None of this is within our jurisdiction of this committee, but I share with the gentleman that like many, there is some flowery language that may end up costing a lot. I would suggest that that's something we should debate in the rules for the floor. I would also suggest that it is subject to appropriations, and that's something that I know the gentleman and I will be working tirelessly throughout October on.
Well, to take back the time I've already yielded, I'd simply point out I've never found them shy about spending money once it's in an authorization. And again, the question recurs, what good have we gotten from these programs to date if we're going to throw even more money at them next year?
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I just want to point out that I'm very glad that on this amendment and on this bill, the gentleman and I have found something we agree on.
And we even resorted to citations from Ghostbusters in the process. Who seeks recognition?
And who says that the Judiciary Committee is not an interesting place to be?
We're trying. The gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Xylazine is a growing concern in the West Coast and particularly in the Puget Sound region where I am, and so I really appreciate this discussion. I think it's a very important discussion. You know, I think that the reality is that these issues do require money. They do require resources, and the SUPPORT Act includes several provisions that do improve public health and safety across the country, including necessary funding for substance abuse and specifically for opioid use disorder programs, which we all are dealing with in our districts. I really appreciate this amendment from Ranking Member Nadler because I think it addresses the concern that I have. Permanently scheduling xylazine does not account for the fact that many people that are currently being impacted by the drug are not taking it knowingly. It is being added to opioids. And so a temporary scheduling process, I think, would allow Congress and the administration time to develop a plan that addresses the supply and the healthcare concerns posed by xylazine, and also to address the unintended consequences that I know some people are concerned about who are dealing with fentanyl right now, which is that if we permanently schedule it, we don't want resources to be taken away from the core crisis of fentanyl, which is still the core crisis that we're dealing with. And so I think that this is a very important amendment in order for me to support the final bill. I do think that scheduling the drug will also significantly impact veterinary medicine, especially a concern given that there isn't a significant diversion of xylazine from veterinary channels. Rather, people are getting it online. So I am rising in support of Mr. Nadler's very sensible amendment, which I think would address the one area of concern that I do have in supporting this bill. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Massey is recognized.
So I have some constitutional concerns with this bill, as you might expect, and some federalism issues. But the constitutional infirmities aside, I want to talk about the practicality of this bill and some of the unintended consequences it might have. I raise cattle. I've never used a tranquilizer gun on one, but I've had some pretty wild ones that I did want to use one of these guns on. I solved that problem by treating them with trailer mycin. If you can catch the cow, you put it in a trailer and go sell it. That takes care of a lot of problems with cattle. But my experience with these dart guns comes from being a county executive. And there's 3,000 counties in the United States, and they all have, you can't call them dog catchers anymore. That's not politically correct. You got to call them animal control officer. And most of these animal control officers have non-lethal means of capturing animals, and it's the most humane way to do it. Our animal control officer in the county that I oversaw as county judge executive kept one of these dart guns in his car. I'm not sure what drugs were in it, but I know that xylazine is one of those drugs that is commonly used in these dart guns to immobilize animals. And there were some, guidelines for keeping these drugs. They were locked, he kept them locked up. But I'm just wondering what effect this would have on the more than 3,000 animal control officers in the country. And if we, Mr. Ivey mentioned PCPs were animal tranquilizers. If we keep going after all of the tranquilizers and say you have to have a PhD or a doctor's degree in order to use these things, then we're forgetting about a lot of other people that may need these for humane methods of capturing animals, whether it could be wildlife control officers. I imagine we'd have these. There's some species that are farmed, like deer and bison, that aren't amenable to normal control methods that these might be used on. And like I said, I've never used one of these dart guns, but just taking a wild guess, and I'm not going to name any names, but I guess some of my neighbors who farm might have one of these guns sitting around just in case they need to tranquilize an animal. They may have a few of these darts sitting around. Do they become a different level of criminal if we pass this law, Mr. Issa? My question was, if you've got a farmer who's, let's say, 2 hours away from the nearest vet, and he keeps one of these dart guns, and it has darts with xylazine in it, and he's not licensed, but nobody really cares, and it's gone on for 20 years.
Now, if the gentleman would yield.
Yeah.
These drugs can be prescribed and held locally. And again, as you know, they're not looking for a dart. They're looking for trafficking, and that's what this law is intended for. So I'm happy to make sure that before this goes to the floor, that the gentleman is comfortable that a vet may prescribe these for use as a tranquilizer. By the way, there are many other tranquilizers. Xylazine is not the preferred one for that particular use.
I imagine almost any of those tranquilizers is open to abuse. I think almost every drug that has been tried as a tranquilizer first. That
we both have children. We know this.
Yeah. So my question isn't can a veterinarian get these drugs after we pass this law? My question is, what about the farmer in a rural area that has one of these dart guns sitting around? It's not sanctioned. He doesn't have a license. He's got 2 or 3 darts in case the animal gets out on the highway and he wants to take control of the situation. Does he go from being a misdemeanor of a state crime to being a federal felon offense.
If the gentleman would yield,
I will yield.
as long as he gets it through his vet, he's going to be fine. So this particular drug will have to be gotten through a vet as a Schedule III drug. It doesn't change that. It just simply isn't an uncontrolled drug you can buy in mass and have a bucket of.
Reclaiming my time. Why can't we just let the states deal with that and determine who should be able to get these darts for animal use?
If the gentleman further yield, look, I have no problem with your dart example. What I have a problem with is the bulk. Right now we cannot control the bulk purchase and distribution leading to it being mixed with fentanyl, when in fact that is making fentanyl a more deadly and more addictive drug, and that's the reason that we want to control the substance.
Reclaiming my time before it expires. I didn't mean to cut you off. I want to say, I do believe there are occasions where these darts are diverted and become drugs, and sometimes that does happen. And I'm sure you would want to stop that from happening as well. My concern is it's just federal overreach. This should be regulated by the state. You're going to unintentionally impact 3,000 counties and 10,000 cities, animal control officers, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd like more time to look at it, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time is expired.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the amendment offered by Mr. Nadler be changed in one and only one sense, which is to take any place the year 1 year is there, that it be made 3 years. So pursuant to the gentleman's amendment, we would agree to a 3-year temporary status, and then we'll work with ENC to make them love it.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for working with us, and I agree with the unanimous consent request.
Then, without objection, the amendment is...
Then I move the previous question, Mr. Chairman.
The question now occurs on the amendment offered as amended by the gentleman from California? New York, sorry, New York. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. So the question is now on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This will be as amended. This will be followed immediately by a vote on reporting the bill. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. Requested vote?
No.
You'll wait for the final.
We'll wait for the final. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on favorably reporting the bill as amended. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is requested. A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan.
None of us have had enough sleep, for the record.
Mr. Issa. Aye. Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates.
If I'd accepted it sooner, I'm afraid.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Bishop. Ms. Spartz. Ms. Spartz votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes yes. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Gooden. Mr. Gooden votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes yes. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore votes yes. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes aye. Ms. Hageman. Ms. Hageman votes yes. Mr. Moran. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Hunt. Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry votes aye. Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu. Mr. Liu votes aye. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse. Ms. McBath, Ms. Dean, Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes aye. Ms. Ross. Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush. Mr. Ivy.
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant. Ms. Ballant votes aye. Mr. Gates, you are not recorded. Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Chair, Mr. Jordan votes yes.
Are there any members who still wish to vote? Then the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 29 ayes and 3 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to follow up on Deborah Ross's suggestion. That went so well. Can you take up the CR now?
The gentleman is way out of order. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 786 to amend Title 28 U.S. Code to provide an additional place for holding court for the Pecos Division of the Western District of Texas and for other purposes, of markup, and move that the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 786 to amend Title 28.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This one is going to be even easier than the CR. Americans rely on the federal courts every day to protect their rights and obtain relief from those rights when they've been violated. This is an important, but thank goodness, simple and bipartisan bill that adds just 2 words and the words "and Alpine" to United States Code to save thousands of Americans in West Texas upwards of 200 miles of driving round trip just to reach a federal courthouse. The bill adds just 2 words, Mount Vernon, to dramatically reduce access to courts for Americans in Western Washington as well. 4 words, and thousands of fellow citizens will be better able to protect their rights and save an amazing amount of carbon. And both Alpine, Texas and Mount Vernon, Washington already have these facilities necessary to hold court. So the cost of this bill is minimal, but in fact, it is a net savings to America. Thank you for supporting this bipartisan bill. And with that, before I lose any votes, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for an opening
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Finding myself in rare agreement with Mr. Issa. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 786 would amend Title 28 of the U.S. Code to provide an additional place for holding court in the Western District of Texas and in the Western District of Washington. Both districts are comprised of wide areas of land. The Western District of Washington takes up half of Washington state, from the Cascade Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. Similarly, the Western District of Texas covers the western 68 counties of the state, encompassing 93,000 square miles. More importantly, a total of approximately 12.2 million people call these 2 districts home. On paper, our basic rights do not change depending where we live. Yet in practice, that is exactly what is happening. Residents of these 2 districts sometimes need to drive for hours to attend court. It makes no sense that just because someone lives in a more rural, wider district, they should incur dramatically increased travel time and administrative costs to seek justice. Adding courthouses is a small step in the right direction towards making the courthouse doors accessible to all Americans, no matter where they live. An easy way to alleviate the burdens on the residents of the Western Districts of Washington and Texas would be to add a courthouse. It would also be a cost-free change because there is an existing facility available for the court to use, and no court personnel would be permanently stationed there. Making use of this existing facility would ensure that litigants, attorneys, witnesses, and other court users would have greater access to the justice that our federal courts provide. The Judicial Conference has recommended the addition of these 2 courthouses, a recommendation that grew even more urgent after the Western District of Washington's Bellingham facility had part of its roof collapse. This country cannot have a flourishing justice system when its buildings are falling apart, its staff are underpaid, and there is a perpetual shortage of judges to fairly administer the laws. This bill will not fix all of these problems. I hope Mr. Issa and I are sponsoring legislation to add more judges. But it will take a small step to help 12.2 million Americans gain equal access to justice, and I think it is a step worth taking. I thank Representatives Tony Gonzalez, Rick Larson, and Susan Del Bene for calling attention to this issue and for working on a bipartisan basis to introduce this legislation to improve the lives of the residents of Texas and Washington. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. Does anyone seek recognition? Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer an amendment to the bill.
Gentleman present his amendment.
I thank the
Clerk
chairman.
will read.
Amendment to H.R. 786, offered by Mr. Neguse of Colorado. Add at the end of the bill the following. District of Colorado, Section 85 of Title 28, United States Code, is amended by inserting after Durango the following: Fort Collins.
Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman reserves a point of order. Gentleman is recognized. Speak on the amendment.
I thank the chairman. Just by way of background, as you all know, I represent the state of Colorado. There are currently 5 federal courthouses in Colorado, including 2 in Denver, 1 in Colorado Springs, 1 in Grand Junction, and 1 in Durango. Now, for those who are less familiar with Colorado geography, that means there are currently no federal courthouses for Coloradans who live in the eastern part of our state, which of course is represented by my good friend Mr. Buck, and in northern Colorado, which happens to be the area that I call home and am proud to represent. The closest federal courthouse for many of my constituents is upwards of 3 hours away without traffic in good road conditions, which, as you might imagine, can be difficult at times in Colorado. Fort Collins, the city that I represent, is the 4th largest city in Colorado. It's located in the northern part of the state. Now, this amendment does something very simple. It simply adds Fort Collins as a place, an additional location in which court proceedings can be held, which, in my view, would provide better access to justice for many Coloradans in that part of our state and the district that I have the privilege of representing. Now, I recognize, I know this has been a delicately negotiated bill, and I certainly do not want to impede in that regard and have respect for my colleague from California and support his bill. And so I will withdraw this amendment, but I thought it was important for the record to bring it forward and to underscore that there are many members of this committee, and I happen to be one of them, who have been pushing for similar legislation in the past. And I would hope that my colleagues would be as supportive as we are of his efforts. And perhaps there's a Republican colleague on the other side of the aisle here who happens to have a similar need, perhaps in the state of Virginia or any of the other states represented here as I look across California, of course, to the chairman. You would have a willing partner in me to develop similar legislation to try to get that across the finish line. So I will withdraw the amendment.
Without
Mr.
objection,
Chairman,
the amendment is withdrawn. Mr. Issa.
In order to close this out, I want to make sure that the gentleman understands, as long as we can get judicial conference for consultation, I would be glad to be your co-sponsor on a similar package, which I'm happy to work on immediately. Today, we're opening the floodgates for consideration of other areas, and I'll be happy to work on yours as an avid visitor of your state.
I thank the gentleman.
Is there further discussion on the bill? Seeing none, a reporting quorum being present, the question is on favorably reporting the bill. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 legislative days to submit views. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 5721, the Rape Kit Backlog Progress Act of 2023, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 5721 to amend the
Without
omnibus.
objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Lee, for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, there's an amendment at the desk.
Opening statement. Opening statement.
Opening statement. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill we are here to discuss today is the Rape Kit Backlog Act of 2023. This is a critically important issue as our committee continues to work for justice for victims of these terrible crimes. There are as many as 100,000 untested rape kits sitting on shelves in law enforcement buildings and DNA labs across the country. Untested rape kits mean no accountability for the predators who are responsible for these violent sex offenses. To make matters worse, these criminals often have lengthy criminal histories. Approximately 70 out of every 1,000 suspected rapists will be arrested for committing another crime before their case is decided. We cannot allow these predators to roam free because a kit has not yet been processed. The Rape Kit Backlog Act of 2023 will improve reporting requirements for state and local governments and provide greater visibility into testing backlogs across the country. It will also allow greater transparency by ensuring that states develop an electronic tracking system so that victims may monitor the status of their kit and therefore the status of their case. Victims deserve to know whether their kit is being tested or whether it is caught in a backlog. And if the backlog continues to persist, states should be held accountable for failing to serve and protect those who live there. Let's take this important step and pass the Rape Kit Backlog Act out of committee and onto the floor for a vote. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 5721, the Rape Kit Backlog Progress Act of 2023, would impose a new reporting requirement on state and local governments that receive funding from the Byrne JAG program, with the goal of providing a clear understanding of the national rape kit backlog and the steps that localities are taking to address it. While the backlog of untested rape kits is a pressing issue that cannot be overlooked, it is essential that we also have transparency and accountability in how federal funds and how federal grant funds are being utilized to tackle this problem and to ensure justice for victims and survivors. Congress has created several grant programs that address rape kit availability and analysis and the rape kit backlog. Most of these programs focus on assisting state and local law enforcement and crime labs to address their backlogs or to find research about the backlog. These grant programs include the Sexual Assault Forensic Exam Program, the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, and the largest of the grant programs, the Debbie Smith DNA Backlog Grant Program, as well as several grants authorized in the Violence Against Women Act. The Rape Kit Backlog represents a profound failure of our criminal justice system, an injustice that leaves survivors of sexual assault without the closure they deserve. These kits contain crucial DNA evidence that can identify perpetrators, connect unsolved cases, prevent further victimization, and exonerate the wrongfully convicted. Yet numerous studies and reports indicate that thousands of these kits remain untested. However, the exact number of untested kits is unknown, since many jurisdictions do not have systems for counting or tracking rape kits, and there's no federal law mandating the tracking or testing of rape kits, nor a federal reporting requirement of any kind. While the federal government has recognized the urgency of addressing this backlog and has dispersed millions of dollars in grant funding, it is vital that we understand the nature and extent of the problem and why it persists. Accountability and transparency are essential to ensure that these funds are being put to their intended use, including the expeditious processing and analysis of rape kits and other DNA evidence, the establishment and use of an inventory system for tracking rape kits, and informing victims of the status of their kits. By requiring this information and the additional elements outlined in the bill, Congress can make informed decisions on how and where to allocate resources in the future and to better meet the needs of local and state agencies working to reduce their backlogs. I understand that various stakeholder groups have raised concerns with certain aspects of this legislation. They have a point. These issues have not been fully vetted since this legislation has neither had a hearing nor sufficient notice before markup to work through these concerns. Despite these deficiencies, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 5721, as it is critical that we have transparency, accountability, and a clear understanding of the rape kit backlog, as well as the progress being made to reduce it. And I hope that we can work together to further improve the bill. I now yield a minute to gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. We passed into law a number of years ago the Rape Survivors Bill of Rights, which prevents the destruction of rape kits, but this, I think, helps provide transparency. I'll just say my county has now caught up on all of the testing. They're within 6 months. This is a question of whether you want to do it or not. And I think the transparency that this will provide will be very helpful. There's no reason why this crime solving action can't be taken in every county in the United States. So I thank you for your comments. I support this bill, especially since it follows up on the Rape Survivors Bill of Rights passed into law some years ago. And with that, I yield back and thank you for letting me speak.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back without objection. All other opening statements will be included in the record. The chair, Mr. Correa, for what purpose do you rise?
Move the strike the last word.
We're going to, okay, the gentleman's recognized. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to concur and support this legislation. A lifetime ago, when I served in the California State Senate, I was able to do a lot of work with DNA as a tool to solve sex crimes. And what you find out is that rape is a heinous crime, and the vast majority of the victims never step up to report this heinous crime. And those that are reported, those victims have to bear a criminal justice system that humiliates them and essentially causes them to essentially back off and rethink their decision to step forward. The average rapist attacks an average of 7 to 8 times before that perpetrator is actually caught. DNA is a very powerful tool, but it's only as powerful as the databases that we have and the connectivity of those databases on a statewide basis. In my county back home in Orange County, I remember numerous cases where the perpetrators, when we analyzed their DNA data, were actually in another state. Connecting all that data together clearly is a step in the right direction when it comes to bringing these animals, these perpetrators, to justice. Anything we can do, everything we can do to make sure that DNA, the victims of these heinous crimes, are brought to justice is a step in the right direction. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Is there further discussion? Chair recognizes Ms. Jackson Lee. Oh, I'm sorry. Chair recognizes Ms. Lee of Virginia. No. Florida. For the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5721.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered base text for the purposes of amendment. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment makes a small grammatical change and does nothing to alter the substance of the bill. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion? Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
I thank the gentleman. This committee has done enormous amount of work dealing with rape kit backlogs and have really made progress along with our Senate colleagues on the issue of backlog. However, any addition that will help expand and improve the rape kit backlog that exists across the nation should be welcomed. As I understand the legislation of Ms. Mace of North Carolina, this particular legislation is going to require reporting requirements to provide greater insight into the national rape kit backlog. For more than 20 years, Congress has provided millions in federal funding through various grant programs, including the Debbie Smith Act and the Violence Against Women Act, to reduce the number of untested rape kits and DNA samples in evidence rooms and crime labs. They still exist. Backlog remains, and there are several studies and countless reports that attempt to provide an estimate of the magnitude of the problem as it exists today. Some claim that there are approximately 100,000 untested kits in America, while others claim that there are at least 400,000 untested kits. I support this legislation because after 2 decades, it's necessary to determine what contributes to that so that we can improve the response in terms of efficiency of testing analysis. Rather than the words that are on my paper, I want to emphasize these are people's lives. Rape and its additional aspects of assault, violence, really changes and impacts people's lives. Tragically, some people, women, don't live. And so it is clearly an important aspect that we find out the whys. But I am aware that several stakeholder groups with varying interests have voiced concerns with certain provisions in this bill. However, as many of my Republican colleagues have asserted in the past, accountability and transparency are vital to the allocation and expenditure of taxpayer funding, and I want to work with those stakeholders to make sure that we are moving in the right direction. The entities that receive millions of dollars in grants should be able to respond to how those grants are being used efficiently. I will just conclude by saying these are people's lives. These are women's lives. These are actions, criminal actions that are devastating, life-changing, and if we can add one small measure of reporting to determine what our next steps should be, I think we should do so. I will have an amendment accordingly, and I would hope that we would move on the amendment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion? Chair recognizes Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When a sexual assault occurring, with a sexual assault occurring about once per minute in this country, it's imperative that people have access to justice that is swift and sure. However, rape kit backlogs are pervasive in jurisdictions throughout the United States. When a rape kit is collected, victims of sexual assault rightfully expect that kit to be tested for DNA. DNA is a crucial tool for law enforcement and prosecutors when seeking to get violent actors off the street. But thousands upon thousands of rape kits sit on shelves in the basements of police stations or labs collecting dust, and sometimes for years. We cannot tell survivors they should report to the police and then let the evidence of their assault or rape simply languish. I have fought to end this endemic problem during my time in Congress, when I discovered a decade ago that in Los Angeles County, there were thousands of rape kits sitting untested at LAPD and the LA Sheriff's Office. I worked hard to bring millions in funding back to Los Angeles to reduce and eliminate those backlogs. I've also been proud to help secure funding for the establishment of the Verdugo Regional Crime Lab, as well as subsequent funding through the DNA Capacity Enhancement and Backlog Reduction Program to tackle this problem. The importance of the work that they do in my community cannot be overstated. They're capable of processing 400 to 600 DNA samples each month from sexual assaults, burglaries, and other crimes. But the rape kit backlog problem persists around the country. The Rape Kit Backlog Progress Act would help improve reporting requirements, increase transparency, which is critical to making progress on ending this terrible backlog. I thank the sponsors of the legislation for the work on the issue and urge my colleagues to join me in voting yes on the underlying bill. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to the sponsors of this bill. I'm a proud co-sponsor as well. Far too many Americans are victims of sexual assault and rape. The Rape Kit Backlog Progress Act of 2023 is an important and overdue piece of legislation that will help get criminals off our streets and bring closure to survivors across the United States. Since their inception in the mid-1970s, sexual assault examination kits have proved to be an invaluable resource to law enforcement, allowing for the collection of evidence after an individual reports that they have been sexually assaulted or raped. Due in part to limited resources, the number of untested kits has grown exponentially. sometimes sitting untouched on shelves in police departments and laboratories for decades. Fortunately, in recent years, many states have begun to allocate their own funds to help clearing the backlog. In 2019, around 16,000 untested sexual assault kits were identified in my home state of North Carolina. Attorney General Josh Stein has worked diligently with law enforcement across the state to test these kits that have been on shelves for years. Since the testing began, AG Stein and the North Carolina Department of Justice have made 86 arrests and counting. Thanks to the FBI's combined DNA index system, other kits in North Carolina have been cross-referenced with this database, and a combined 156 arrests have been made. Many of the perpetrators were found to have committed the same crime multiple times. In addition, and importantly, some individuals have been exonerated after being incarcerated for crimes they did not commit. And North Carolina has a DNA innocence law that allows that evidence to come forward even after conviction. This bill will ensure that other states do as North Carolina has done and undertake an audit of the number of kits in their possession awaiting testing. As I said, I'm a proud co-sponsor of this bill, and I urge my colleagues' support. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion? Ms. Scanlon.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Hundreds of thousands of rape kits are currently sitting untested in police departments and crime lab storage facilities around the country, and that's simply unacceptable. DNA evidence is a powerful tool that supports law enforcement's ability to solve crimes and prevents offenders from harming other people. It also helps survivors achieve the justice they deserve. In recent years, our leadership in Pennsylvania has undertaken serious work to clean up the backlog of thousands and, in some cases, decades of untested rape kits. Under our former Attorney General, Josh Shapiro, we saw the backlog for the entire state of Pennsylvania through the state police cleared. And in Philadelphia, we saw a 1,500 test kit backlog cleared over the last few years. And that data allowed the prosecution of dozens of additional offenders. So this progress has been incredibly impactful, but we need to keep it up. And other states have backlogs of their own to address. We've heard from several members that the vagaries of funding and leadership can be an impediment to getting this work done. So I'm really pleased that this bipartisan bill would add critical accountability to clear the backlogs, to solve crimes, and deliver justice. So I look forward to voting this bill out of committee today and hope all of our colleagues will do the same. I yield back.
Is there further discussion? Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, sir. Like Mr. Schiff and others, I've worked on this issue for a long time. I'm a co-sponsor of this bill, and I appreciate it being brought, and I commend this prime sponsor. We had a tragic situation in Memphis that shows the need for this bill and the reporting requirements. Last year in early September, there was a young lady who was jogging, and she was abducted, kidnapped, and murdered. It made the national news for 4 consecutive days. It was an event that turned Memphis on its heels and made people realize that crime is so potentially, everybody's potentially a victim, but it was a young woman who had done so much to help others, and she's killed. It was later found out about 3 weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, that the gentleman, I shouldn't say gentleman, the individual who kidnapped and murdered her had been accused of assaulting and sexually assaulting and raping a woman 11 months earlier. The rape kit result did not get back to the police from the state rape kit group until after the lady in Memphis had been kidnapped and murdered. It took 11 and a half months for that kit to come back, and it showed that the same man who committed the murder and kidnapping had committed the rape of this woman. The man had been in jail for 18 years, having kidnapped an individual in Memphis, and had been out of jail for only about a year. That young lady would not have been raped, would not have been kidnapped and murdered, but for the failure of the state to have a sufficient number of individuals employed at the rape program, KIT program in Tennessee, to allow that kit to be studied, analyzed, and the result being been known. So this is important. We need to keep reviews over these departments, make sure they're doing their job. Getting money is not sufficient. We've got to stand heard on them. So thank you. Pass the bill. Let's get it done. I yield back.
Is there further discussion? Ms. Ballant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sexual assault survivors across this country, my constituents, your constituents, assume, of course they do, they assume that their rape kits will be tested. They take this really intrusive and very traumatic step because they believe that the evidence will be tested, it will be examined, and then used as evidence. The public also believes this, and yet this is not the case. So estimates are that hundreds of thousands of rape kits across the country sit on shelves untested. And my message this morning is simple. We need to take this important step to right this outrageous wrong. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Further discussion. Mr. Ivey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend the gentlelady for this amendment and the language that she brings forth. As I read this, there is a reporting requirement to the extent that a jurisdiction fails to meet that reporting requirement, which is to generate a report in a year, then that state or unit of local government shall become ineligible for a grant under the subpart. And I agree with that. I think that's fine. But I do want to flag this for the committee. So when we get the report a year from now, we're going to have a lot of jurisdictions that have failed to get up to speed on the testing requirement. And I want to say this now. I think we have to come up with penalties that, or some sort of trigger that requires them to get that done. I'm not necessarily willing to go to the point of we're going to terminate all grants for those jurisdictions. But depending on how bad the problem is when we get the report back, we might need to do that. Because frankly, I've been hearing about this for decades now. We've been trying to get these test kits done. When I was a local prosecutor, I was elected in Maryland for 2 terms, and we were just sort of getting these test kits, and the DNA systems were coming up, and we saw 2 tracks. One was the conviction rates, because it's very powerful when you get the DNA evidence. And as has been said by others this morning, frequently someone who's been an offender in another case has an offender in the pending case, and having that information for that trial is important for sure. It helps to make it more likely you'll get a conviction. But also, as we've been saying this morning, it also preempts the possibility of that second rape occurring if you know at the time the first rape occurs that you've got DNA evidence and you can use that for prosecution at the time. And then the other thing I saw too, in many instances when I was a prosecutor, was people were cleared during the investigation stage of a rape. And so I had several cases, and we were discussing this offline previously, where we thought we had the right person. He'd been arrested, he met the description, everything lined up from a traditional investigative standpoint. Then the DNA results come back, and you've got the wrong guy. So I think it's critical for us to get this done, and as Ms. Ballant was just saying a moment ago, essentially law enforcement makes a promise to these survivors when we put them through this intrusive process, and to the extent some of them have gone through a trial even, and you have the scenario where someone potentially was wrongfully convicted, that victim's going to have to go through another process again potentially and deal with being re-traumatized again. So I think it's critical for us to move forward. I again thank the gentlelady for for this language, but we need to make sure we are willing to take the steps when we get the report back, because I'll bet dollars to donuts on what it's going to say. We're going to have jurisdictions out there that are going to be way behind on testing kits, and they will have been way behind for decades, maybe even some in Maryland, so I might get in trouble with some of my local constituents. But we need to get this going, and we need to move it forward, and we have to do that by showing we're serious, and sometimes that includes penalties and sanctions to move local and state governments forward. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman is back. Is there any further discussion?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman reserves a
I have
point
an
of order.
amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5721 offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment and the substitute be considered as read and should be considered the base text for purposes of amendment. Oh, hold on.
The amendment.
I'm sorry. The amendment we considered as read. The gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think we have heard every member on this committee join in their complete support for the cruciality of legislation that would determine why across the landscape of America there are backlogs. And we have even had devastating recounting of the loss of life because the DNA rape kit was not returned. As you well know, this work has been done through this committee, and I have been certainly focused on this work, the Debbie Smith Act, but we worked very hard on the Violence Against Women Act, that in particular would be impacting all across the nation. Houston had a challenge, Texas had a challenge, and I was specifically concerned with the Violence Against Women Act in my own home generation, in my own jurisdiction, which would include the local lab that faced these insurmountable challenges. So the Judiciary Committee is on record for abhorring the slowness in some areas that have cost lives and, of course, innocent women in particular to be assaulted violently, because violent criminals have not been taken off the streets because we have failed to process the DNA on the rape kit. So I have a great respect for the gentlewoman from North Carolina, but it does not mean that we should not do our job. So we have heard of the concerns by certain stakeholders, which, by the way, include police officers who are concerned. And so as H.R. 5720 is currently written, failure to comply with the new reporting requirements outlined in this bill would render any state or local government ineligible to apply for the heart and soul of those corrective grants, the Burn JAG grant funds. I want to put a hammer down. We want those reporting requirements to be in, but our states are big and small. The JAG grants are their lifeline for fighting crime. And any state or local government that has received Burn JAG funds but fails to meet these new reporting requirements within 1 year of enactment would render any such entity totally ineligible for a Burn grant. That's your small towns, your hamlets, your villages, your cities. This penalty could have a devastating impact on many states and local governments. So my amendment would make ineligibility for Debbie Smith grants the penalty for failure to meet the reporting requirements detailed in H.R. 5721. Those are important grants, as these additional conditions for eligibility are directly linked to the goals and purposes of the Debbie Smith Backlog Grant Program. The additional provision of this bill would also be inserted into the appropriate statutory sections as indicated. My amendment simply says Don't kill the lifeline of police departments across America. You end their burn grants, here's what you will end. Programs necessary to support law enforcement, prosecution and courts, prevention and education, corrections and community correction, drug treatment and enforcement, planning, evaluation, technology improvement, crime victim and witness initiatives, mental health programs, and related law enforcement and correction programs, and implementation of state crisis intervention, court proceedings, and related programs or initiatives. This should be conveyed to the author of this legislation. I would think that she would have absolutely no concern in engaging on this very point, because her intent is an excellent intent, and that is to get us focused on the backlog. But when you take and eliminate the burn grants, you are literally shutting down law enforcement in every single state and hamlet and county and city. And I think of Houston, I think of Harris County, and I think of them not having access to lifeline grants in protecting the community. And let me be clear that I love the Carolinas, but Representative Mace is from South Carolina. I had her in another beautiful state of Carolina, but she is from South Carolina, and I welcome her work. For that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back with the passion that this can be made better. We can work together, but you are cutting off the lifeline of our friends in law enforcement on those burn grants. Well,
The gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion? Does the gentleman withdraw his point of order? Point of order is withdrawn. Is there further discussion?
Well, turned it off. Ms. Lee as well. I think we can find a common ground. We are all passionate about this legislation. If you look at the details of it, you'll see that the cut into the burn grants really impact other law enforcement work. And so with that, hopefully, a commitment, Ms. Lee, I don't know, I know that you are, I know it's Ms. Mace, but hopefully we can all work together. I will withdraw the amendment at this time. Ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Is there further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on reporting the bill. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of substitute is adopted. The reporting requirement being present, the question is on favorably reporting the bill as amended. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Gentlemen, ask for a recorded vote. A recorded vote's been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan. Mr. Issa. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Biggs. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Roy. Mr. Bishop. Ms. Spartz. Ms. Spartz votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes yes. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Gooden. Mr. Gooden votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Nels. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes aye. Ms. Hageman. Ms. Hageman votes aye. Mr. Moran. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Hunt. Mr. Hunt votes aye. Mr. Fry. Mr. Nadler. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes yes.
Are there any other members that wish to vote?
Mr. Fry, you're not recorded. Mr. Fry votes yes.
Are there any other members who wish to vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 26 ayes and 0 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 1105, the Debbie Smith Act of 2023, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1105 to amend the
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hunt, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are pleased to have the Debbie Smith Act of 2023 before our committee today. Debbie Smith's story is tragic, and sadly, when that happens all too often in our country. In 1989, Debbie Smith was sexually assaulted by a stranger who broke into her home. Although she underwent an exam, the DNA evidence went unanalyzed for 5 years. Eventually, the evidence was entered into the FBI's national database. A suspect was found and brought to justice, but justice took far too long. You may remember the story of Eliza Fletcher, a young mother of 2 and kindergarten teacher from Memphis who was abducted and murdered while out on a morning jog. But her killer should have never been on the streets in the first place. He should have been in jail for raping another woman in a prior year. He wasn't in jail, though, because the rape kit that tied him to the crime was never processed. These stories must stop. Women are worth protecting. As a father of 2 daughters, I take this very seriously, and I'm sure I have many colleagues, if not all of my colleagues, on both sides of the aisle that feel the exact same way. There are as many as 100,000 untested rape kits sitting on the shelves in law enforcement buildings and DNA labs across this nation. Because of this, how many rapists still remain at large in this country? We have the tools to catch them, not just the resources. And as a country, we have to do everything in our power to protect women against violence. We all know the phrase, justice delayed is justice denied. But in the case of rape kit backlogs, justice delayed emboldens criminals and endangers women. We can't let criminals roam the streets because of a delay in processing rape kits. We must protect women. We must reauthorize the Debbie Smith Act. Congress passed the Debbie Smith Act in 2004 and reauthorized it in 2008, 2014, and 2019 to support public crime laboratories' work to build capacity and process DNA evidence, including evidence collected in rape kits. We look forward to passing this legislation again and helping secure justice for victims of these heinous crimes. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman is back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1105, the Debbie Smith Act of 2023, would reauthorize landmark legislation first enacted in 2004, which has been instrumental in addressing the backlog of untested rape kits sitting in evidence rooms and crime labs across the country. Nearly 20 years ago, when I helped lead efforts to enact the original version of this legislation, I said, quote, "It is imperative that we eliminate the shameful backlog of untested rape kits," unquote. Despite our best efforts, the backlog still exists, and my thoughts remain the same. It is imperative that we eliminate the rape kit backlog, full stop. For every rape kit that is yet to be tested, there is a victim of an unspeakable crime who has yet to see justice or find closure. And in some cases, there is an individual languishing in prison who does not belong there. It is for these reasons that we must continue the crucial mission of this legislation and ensure justice for survivors and for the wrongfully convicted. Over the past 2 decades, the Debbie Smith Act has been vital in supporting the processing and analysis of rape kits, DNA collection and analysis, and victim resources. Millions of dollars have been allocated to increase the capacity of forensic laboratories in countless jurisdictions, provide DNA training and education to thousands of law enforcement personnel, and provide support services to a multitude of victims. As a result of this legislation, thousands of cases have been solved, and countless survivors have finally received the justice they so rightly deserve. While we laud the numerous achievements made possible by this legislation, ultimately we know that funding is vital to the success of this grant program. That is why I offered an amendment to similar legislation during the 107th Congress that would increase the authorization of funds to address the backlog to $150 million. Although the Debbie Smith Act was authorized to provide up to $151 million in grant funds during the following Congress, the full amount has never been appropriated, and it appears that the amounts appropriated are decreasing each year. Failure to fully fund this program limits the capacity to address the backlog, which often numbers in the thousands and has worsened largely due to the pandemic. Delays in testing undermine public safety, allowing dangerous criminals to evade apprehension and potentially commit additional crimes. That is why I hope that the appropriators will fully fund this program going forward. Reauthorizing the Debbie Smith Act makes our communities safer. By investing in DNA testing and forensic technology, we empower law enforcement agencies to identify perpetrators more efficiently and to link them to other unsolved cases. This not only brings closure to victims and their families, but it also prevents future crimes by removing serial offenders from our streets. Reauthorizing the Debbie Smith Act also sends a clear message to survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and other crimes that we stand with them. The Debbie Smith Act has proven to be a bipartisan beacon of hope, shining a light on justice, sometimes long denied. I support H.R. 1105, which reauthorizes this crucial legislation and emphasizes our commitment not only to public safety, but also to survivor support and crime prevention. I urge my colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back without objection. All other statements will be included in the record. Is there any discussion on the motion? Ms. Jackson-Lee.
I'd like to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I strongly support H.R. 1105, the Debbie Smith Act of 2023. Having served on this committee now for more than 20 years, I'm reminded of the tragic journey that we have taken, or had to take, when these legislative initiatives were not in place, and the negative impact across the nation, but more importantly, on women victims of rape, which includes children, that would reauthorize this bill, presently would reauthorize critical grant funding aimed at ending the rape kit backlog. I'm proud to be one of 4 original co-sponsors of this bipartisan legislation, and I'm proud to stand with Ranking Member Steve Cohen and Representative Wesley Hunt. And I'm encouraged by the number of co-sponsors, Republicans and Democrats, who have joined us, including Ranking Member Nadler, Chairman Biggs, and many other members of this committee. We must find a level of which there is absolutely no backlog, that these cases are treated such that we are fighting crime in the immediate time and saving lives. H.R. 1105 reauthorizes legislation that provides resources to state and local enforcement agencies and prosecutors to reduce the national backlog of DNA evidence, most notably rape kits. Although DNA evidence has proven critical to solving crimes and delivering justice, particularly in crimes of sexual violence, there is still challenges to holding offenders accountable using such evidence. Research has shown that testing backlog kits can lead to combined DNA index system hits as well as arrests and convictions. One study of 491 untested kits in the possession of the Houston Police Department yielded 104 CODIS hits after testing, and 16 of those hits led to arrests. Just one can save lives of future victims, potential victims of rape, and certainly bring conviction to those, unfortunately, that have fallen victim to the heinous crime of rape. Violent, devastating, and sometimes resulting in loss of life. Debbie Smith grants have helped reduce the backlog in jurisdictions in every corner of the country. For instance, the New York Times reported that my home state of Texas had a backlog of approximately 20,000 untested kits in 2013, and according to a report by the Dallas Morning News, that number was reduced to just over 6,000 by 2021. Yes, we want to be down to zero. Unfortunately, a measure of the progress made in reducing the national backlog was lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, recognizing the accomplishments made since the Debbie Smith Act first became law, I'm very confident that we will once again reduce the number of untested samples and rape kits and eventually end the backlog, but more importantly, bring these violent criminals to justice. It is now up to Congress to make certain that every victim and every survivor experiences the relief she felt, knowing that her rapist could no longer harm her loved ones, or her community. That is why I will do all that I can to ensure that every rape kit is tested and every sample is analyzed so that no survivor's voice is silenced, no victim's cry for justice goes unanswered, no family continues to mourn because of loss of life of their loved ones, and no criminal goes free because of a failure to act. This is a heinous act that will always be remembered by the victim that lives, and so we must find a solution. That includes supporting this bill and encouraging my colleagues to do the same. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Is there further discussion? Mr. Klein.
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the comments from the gentlelady from Texas in support of this important legislation. The rape kit backlog is a significant impediment to prosecuting perpetrators of sexual assault. DNA evidence gathered from rape kits is often critical for bringing perpetrators of sexual assault to justice. Congress passed the Debbie Smith Act in 2004 and reauthorized it in 2008, 2014, and 2019 to support public crime laboratories' work to build capacity and process DNA evidence, including evidence collected in rape kits. As a former prosecutor, I know all too well how critical evidence is to achieving justice for the victims of sexual assault. I'm proud to be one of the original co-sponsors of this effort to reauthorize the Debbie Smith Act, ensuring that our law enforcement agencies will once again have the support and resources that they need to reduce unacceptable DNA backlogs and hold violent predators accountable for their crimes. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Ms. Dean.
Move to strike the last word.
Will these recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of H.R. 1105, the Debbie Smith Act of 2023. The bill, as we have discussed, would reauthorize through 2029 the Debbie Smith DNA Backlog Grant Program, providing grants to state and local governments to improve and expand the collection and analysis of DNA evidence, including evidence in sexual assault kits. I'm a proud co-sponsor of this bill. In Pennsylvania, we struggled with a serious backlog in rape kits. In 2015, we had more than 3,000 untested rape kits. We have made progress in Pennsylvania, but we still have a backlog. It is reported in 2022 in Pennsylvania, we had 186 backlog sexual assault kits awaiting testing, up from 2020 by 22%. There should be no backlog of rape kits, because each one of these kits represents a person who has gone through an extraordinary violent trauma, a survivor, who submitted to an invasive exam in the hope that one day she or he would find justice or would protect another from suffering the similar violence. The nationwide rape kit backlog is one of the biggest obstacles to prosecutions. Think about it. For every 1,000 rapes, only 13 are ever referred to prosecution. We've got to get to that. And only 7 will result in a conviction. And adding to this very sad number of prosecutions and convictions is the backlog of rape kits. So I'm pleased to support the Debbie Smith Act of 2023. I'm a co-sponsor. I'm also proud that we just passed by committee the Rape Kit Backlog Progress Act, which will continue essential support for state and local government to process rape kits, to increase transparency for rape survivors. We must do everything we can to address this unbearable situation, and we must find more prosecutions, more convictions, and save more people from this sexual violence. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion? Mr. Van Drew.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Just very briefly, we spend money on all types of things in this House of Representatives. We allocate money, and it just amazes me that we still have this issue of backlogs. I mean, this is just an issue of humanity. It's an issue of doing the right thing, of believing that somebody who's gone through this horrendous crime and will never recover for the rest of their lives, at least that we take care of them and help them in any way we can. I remember through my years in the state Senate and in other capacities just being horrified when I would get calls from women and they were part of the backlog and didn't get the services they need. They need closure of some kind. So just in the name of humanity, I hope not only, I know we will pass this, and I'm so happy to see that it is bipartisan, but I believe also that we should do all that we can to ensure not only is that this piece of legislation passed, that the appropriations are made to ensure that there is no longer a backlog. You know, words are easy in speeches, but the reality when you get out in the street and talk to these women is different, and we have to fix that. I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Is there further discussion? Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would rise in support of this reauthorization legislation, and I also agree with my colleague, Mr. Van Drew, about the fact that talk is cheap. Now, we can reauthorize funding for this very necessary program, while at the same time, Congress is at a point where we need to pass a spending bill in order to keep the government open and keep programs like this funded. But what we have is extremist MAGA Republicans who want to cut the budget to the bone. They want to cut back, in some cases, 30% from our spending level of today. This is, and we have a few extremist MAGA Republicans who are insisting that we do that in order to fund the government. Well, if we do that, then programs such as this will take a big hit. And so it makes no sense to say one thing and then vote another. We need to be consistent. We need to recognize that over the years we have been defunding government, including law enforcement. And that seeps down to the state and local level as well. We have governors who pound their chest when they announce the relocation of a factory to their state. But what they don't say is that they have offered the multi-billion-dollar corporation relocating to their state tax incentives to relocate. So in other words, states are now embarking upon a race to the bottom to promise already wealthy, multinational, in many cases, corporations, tax abatements if they will relocate their factories to that particular state. And so if a state is taking in less revenue, then it can't fund its state crime lab, which processes these rape kits. So we've had years after year of defunding government, one way or the other, federal and state, which has produced the dilemma that we now find ourselves in, which is there's not enough money to process these rape kits all across the country. We need to stop and think about what we're doing as we continue this trend of defunding government. We need government to protect the people, and this is a way that we protect the people by being able to process these rape kits. We've got to have money for training of officers. Some officers may not fully appreciate the need to collect this evidence when allegations are made. Some local law enforcement departments don't have the technology to keep up with these rape kits that are brought in but never sent to the crime lab. And as I said before, the state crime labs are overburdened and can't get to much of the stuff that they have to analyze. And so it all goes back to funding. We need to fund training. We need to fund equipment, technology. We need to fund capacity increases. And you can't do that when you're cutting federal government coffers to the bone. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Seeing none, a reporting quorum being present, the question is on favorably reporting the bill. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Mr. Klein requests a recorded vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan. Mr. Issa. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Roy. Mr. Bishop. Ms. Spartz. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes yes. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Gooden. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes yes. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore votes yes. Mr. Kiley. Ms. Hageman. Ms. Hageman votes yes. Mr. Moran. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Hunt. Mr. Hunt votes aye. Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry votes yes. Mr. Nadler. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu. Ms. Jayapal. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath. Ms. Dean. Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Ross. Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush. Mr. Ivy.
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant. Mr. Kiley, you're not recorded. Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Buck, you're not recorded. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman votes yes. Mr. Gooden votes aye.
Are there any other members who wish to vote who have not yet voted? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 28 ayes and 0 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Who seeks recognition? Yeah, Mr. Neguse.
Just parliamentary inquiry, if I might.
Gentleman state his inquiry.
I see that we've been rejoined by the chairman of this august committee. I understand that there's some type of impeachment proceeding in another committee. My understanding was centuries of precedent established that this House, this committee within the House, is actually the proper committee of jurisdiction to consider any kind of articles of impeachment. And I wonder if the chairman might be willing to perhaps explain why this committee has been robbed of its jurisdictional province over impeachment.
Is the gentleman saying he wants articles of impeachment?
Far from it. I'd like to see the government funded, but I'm just trying to understand why
I think we would too.
Oversight Committee has become the Judiciary Committee. Perhaps Chairman Jordan might be able to.
Chair yields to the chairman.
If there are articles, I would just say that if there are articles of impeachment, I think the gentleman from Colorado knows. I believe he might have been a manager on one of the impeachments recently here in our great country. If there are articles of impeachment, that will come in front of this committee, unlike it did when you were an impeachment manager in the last impeachment.
Well, I thank the chairman for his response. I might add that with respect to that second impeachment, that was days after an insurrection in which there was an effort to subvert the peaceful transfer of power. But nonetheless, I do remember withering criticism from my colleagues 4 years ago with respect to the first impeachment and their protestations.
The gentleman's not recognized for
I
general
understand.
debate.
I appreciate the chairman's indulgence nonetheless.
But we were in the middle of a roll call. The ayes have it. The bill's ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views without objection. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. The committee will take a brief recess before considering the